Okay, morning everybody. I think we're going straight into the next paper. My name is James McGurk. I'm chairing this paper today. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Iain Grant, who is one of the founder members of the philosophy department here at UWE, and a lovely man as well. I've just met him. It seems very, very, very pleasant. He's the author of two books. The first is called Philosophies of Nature After Schelling. The second one, written with Sean Watson and Jeremy Dunham, is called Idealism, and he asked me not to mention the subtitle, A Philosophical History, so I'm going to do it anyway. He's also working on a third book, which is called Grounds, Themes and Powers. Is that right? Ground, Time and Powers in Schelling. So there's a second book on Schelling, and he tells me that he actually hates Schelling. So his paper today is entitled, let me see. Paper is entitled Philosophy and the Natural History of Mind. So without further ado, Iain.
Thank you very much, James. Yeah.
Can you just talk to the microphone?
Not easily, actually. It's being fixed.
Will we move?
Is that okay? Do you mind if I shout? Can everyone hear me? Yeah. So I'll project, if I may. Thank you, James. Very kind introduction. And going on flimsy evidence, I might add, to make judgments of character on the basis of 5 minutes over coffee, especially at this time in the morning. Anyway, things get far worse as we go on. So my title is actually slightly altered from the programme's Autofusis Philosophia, which is Schelling's term for what's going on in the process of mythological thinking. Mythological thinking, as we'll come to later on in the paper, consists of exactly what nature is doing when it thinks. Exactly what nature is doing when it thinks. And if it is credible to make a claim that what nature is doing exactly when it thinks has a character at all, there must be reasons for that. And the reasons for that are the reasons that I want to investigate in this paper. I say I hate Schelling, not in the way one, hates football or art or, churches or whatnot, but in the way that one hates something that prevents sleep. So I'll start now with a brief introduction. I'm conscious here that upon meeting Rudolf earlier, I mentioned that I hated art and hated the moving image. I'm now going to renege on that and talk about a recent movie called Source Code. Source Code is, in this movie, an experimenter in quantum worlds creates a technology that allows a test subject 8 minutes of post-mortem access, to 8 minutes from a source code recovered from witnesses' post-mortem brain activity. This activity records events that have already taken place, in this case, a bombing, requiring only a prospective host possessing, quote, similar synaptic patterns to the test subject. That subject is then enabled to reoccupy those minutes of the host's life immediately prior to the bomb's detonation in order to discover who planted it and to organise the bomber's arrest and so preempt further attacks. But what's source for the subject is a host for the host. It turns out that the reoccupied synaptic patterns occur not in temporarily reassigned past. That's a lovely phrase from the movie. The experimenter explaining to the test subject what's going on. We're not engaging, he says, in time travel. This is time reassignment. And the only person to my mind who's made a similar claim is Immanuel Kant. Anyway, it's a worth watching movie if you're interested in interesting things. It turns out that the reoccupied synaptic patterns occur not in temporarily reassigned pasts, but forge new events and at least one additional actuality. In other words, the discovery is that there is no such thing as an actuality-neutral source, or no such thing as experience without nature. Second part of my paper then abandons movies for invention and identity. The problem I wish to engage here derives from the status of termini in transcendental arguments. For it is by way of such arguments that it is demonstrated that no nature need exist in order that I experience. Hence the late Husserl's arguments seeking to re-Ptolemaize the Copernican turn. In the earth, the original arc does not move. Hence also the arguments belonging to Fichte's science of knowing, that nature is only possible as a determination of the Nicht-Ich by the Ich, so that so determines it. Hence also, for instance, McDowell's argument that any nature there can be said to be is a nature that can only be said to be, and as such plays neither a fundamental nor even a necessary role in the explanation of the mindedness of the world minds mentate about. Yet since transcendental arguments are ultimately conditioned by their termini, such that their conclusions cannot legitimately be extended beyond the immediate sphere within which they arise, this is an argument that David Bell makes about transcendental arguments. He calls them, for that reason, parochial. Since, in other words, transcendental arguments are ultimately conditioned by their termini, such that their conclusions cannot legitimately be extended beyond the immediate sphere within which they arise, they limit what can be talked about rather than stipulating what is not. That is, transcendental arguments begin and end by reducing nature to experience. Or, the alpha and omega of experience coincide in the elimination from mind of a mind-independent nature. From this, two prospects open. The first is to accept the elimination, hence what I've called eliminative idealism. The second is to accept the identity of mind and nature. Since I agree with the German idealist philosopher Schelling that it is not because there is thinking that there is being, but rather because there is being that there is thinking, I cannot agree with the former, and so will argue for a species of the latter. That extraordinary footnote is tantamount to, I think, a confutation, if you like, of assumptions made about German idealism, assumptions which have become all the more pernicious given what lessons are contemporarily being drawn from it. Transcendental arguments begin and end, that is, by reducing nature to experience. The first prospect is to accept the elimination, the second to accept the identity of mind and nature, and I'm going to argue for the latter. But before continuing, a caveat. The suggestion of an identity between mind and nature seems, but only seems, to entail a reciprocity between them, such that, for instance, normally, as if 2 articles a decade can be called normal, ascribe to Schelling's desideratum that nature should be, soul, mind made visible, mind invisible nature. It's a citation from the Ideas for Philosophy of Nature, 1797. Yet this should be entails, a point Hegel would make repeatedly against Fichte, that it is not. Reciprocity, Wechselwirklichkeit, or operating by mutuality, amounts to a trap for identitarians regarding mind and nature. Against this, it is necessary to retain the unbreachable asymmetry between being and thinking, while formulating in what such an identity consists. Lest the point be lost in jargon, if nature did not think, are only non-natural candidates conceivably capable of it? And are such things even conceivable themselves? I'd just like to repeat that. If nature did not think, are only non-natural candidates conceivably capable of it? And are such things as non-natural candidates conceivable at all? There are 2 ways in which Kant accounts for transcendental arguments, 2 termini he provides for the satisfaction of their deductions. The first concerns the function of apperception, which is that source to which transcendental deduction leads, and from which its legitimacy ultimately derives. By legitimacy, I mean satisfies the question quid juris. The second, simpler in appearance, concerns the manner in which concepts can relate a priori to objects. And that's a citation from the first critique, K85, B117. I will briefly address each in turn. For Kant, a transcendental argument is concluded just when a concept may be traced back to its originating faculties, and the question, therefore, of its legitimate usage settled. Since Kant claims we enjoy, as a matter to be demonstrated as fact, possession of concepts that do not derive from experience, the terminus of the transcendental deduction necessary to demonstrating their source cannot lie in the world as the object, nor as the totality of objects of experience, but only in a transcendental function that unites concepts deriving from sensibility, Sinnlichkeit, with those deriving from the understanding of Verstand. It is the function of this function to forge experience. That is, we may say with Jean-François Lyotard, that such function is subjective precisely and only in the sense that the faculty that exercises it is the same as the one that invents it. And that's from his lessons on the analytic of the sublime. This argument was subsequently made, interestingly, it's not confined, as it were, to Lyotard. The argument was subsequently made by Bernadette Vincent to describe Lavoisier's creation of chemical objects. She writes in a volume edited by Michel Serres on Elements for the History of Science that chemistry creates its own objects. It fabricates its universal as transparent to reason. By which I take it she means something like the following. In order to have rationally transparent objects, it's necessary that reason fabricate those objects. This is an argument that one can imagine Kant being happy with to the extent that it is allowed only that is transcendental. There's an odd motion, an odd movement, or an odd moment, therefore, in the history of transcendental philosophy going on in Lavoisier's chemistry, which is itself, I think, worthy of investigation. On this understanding, the subjectivity vital to transcendental philosophy is rather autonomic than autonomous. The generation of experience is what concepts do, even unto dreams. Yet they must be apperceived, Kant adds, that is, grasped by a subject whose experience is thus generated as that subject's experience. And this is simply what's called spontaneity. Yet invention cannot go it alone. And here are Kant's caveats. As Kant says, the imagination does indeed become very mighty when it creates a second nature. That's from the Critique of Judgment. But it can only do so from the materials that first nature provides. Experience is therefore forged by transcendental means only given the participation of the paradoxical non-faculty of receptivity. Receptivity is not, strictly speaking, a faculty or Vermögen, but rather a capacity, a Fähigkeit, to be affected by objects, which term is Gegenstände in that particular sentence. And that necessarily, Kant adds, precedes all intuition of these objects. So a capacity to be affected by objects, Gegenstände, things that stand over and against me, is necessary not only to intuition of those objects, but must necessarily precede the intuition of those objects. Whence, therefore, the necessity with which this capacity precede all intuition. The suggestion is that in order that experience not become a frictionless filling in the void, it needs to be grounded in an antecedent to which the function of invention, of forging experience, remain open. So because receptivity, as the one remaining non-spontaneous power amidst the economy of the faculties, is necessary in order to generate experience, it follows that the transcendental deduction of experience yet requires a basis or a ground lying outside itself, and that its terminus be set back. Nevertheless, Kant insists that an argument seeking its terminus in such a nature remains transcendental. I entitle, says Kant, the explanation of the manner in which concepts can relate a priori to objects transcendental. I thus turn to the second element of Kant's approach to transcendental termini. That second element being the manner in which concepts can relate a priori to objects. Consider this claim that Kant has just made. It involves a relation anterior to the relata, as the manner in which concepts can relate a priori to objects. It is this relatedness, then, rather than nature and mind so related, that provides the ultimate ground of the subjective function of creating experience. A function, to remind ourselves, that transcendental philosophy, that is, that philosophy which promotes a gulf between nature and abstraction, causality and event, such that neither the former in each pair is sufficient to account for the latter, nor the latter for the former, has as its hallmark. Nevertheless, the suggestion that there is an a priori relation between concept and object is a radical one, insofar as it proposes an oblique transection of transcendental autochthony, which is a term I couldn't resist for a synonym for spontaneity, really. Transcendental autochthony. What could be more pleasant? Of the subjectivity attaching to the function by which experience is generated, a fundamental irreducibility of the object to the autonomy of the function. By this account, transcendental philosophy may sustain the relation between mind and nature without stipulating their identity. Yet because the termini of transcendental reduction remain apperception in the first case and the relation in the second, the prospect of a necessary antecedent to the autonomous generation of experience begs the question as to the termination of arguments ending with them. In the case of generation, regardless of the actual or experienced antecedents of that generation with respect to the subject's apperception of it, a first nature remains necessary. In the second case, that of the a priori relation of concept and object, if they are so related, this relation is primary either with respect to their separation or with respect to both subject and object. Neither first nature nor the a priority of relation have been deduced, which, as the introduction to the Critique of Judgment would make clear, required Kant to revisit the foundations of transcendental philosophy. It is at this point that Schelling's investigations in the introduction to the Ideas for the Philosophy of Nature enter the picture. In that work, and in subsequent editions, both of that and other of his nature philosophical books, Schelling attempts to understand how it is possible that mind could be other than nature. How it is possible that mind could be other than nature. I will cite an extended passage to which I will return throughout what follows. For we require to know, writes Schelling, not how such a nature arose outside of us. We do not require to know how nature arose outside of us, but how even the very idea of such a nature has got into us. How the very idea of such a nature has gotten into us. I just want to pause, because the word idea, Idee in Schelling's German, is used, the English term is used equivalently by Errol Harris and Peter Heath to render both Vorstellung and idea, which makes it almost impossible to tell when Schelling is criticizing Kant and when, by contrast, he is praising Plato. Here, manifestly, we have a Platonism. The Platonism consists in the idea that gets into us. Okay? There is an idea, and it gets into us. We'll be discussing this in a moment as the reversal of the access problem, if you like. So we require to know not how such a nature arose outside of us, but how even the very idea of such a nature has gotten into us. Not merely how we have arbitrarily generated it, say, but how and why it originally and necessarily underlies everything that our species, Geschlecht, has ever thought about nature. What we want is not that nature should coincide with the laws of our mind by chance, as if through some third intermediary, but that she herself, necessarily and originality, should not only express, but even realize the laws of our mind, and that she is and is called nature only insofar as she does so. Nature, he concludes in a famous sentence, should be mind made visible, mind the invisible nature. Here then, in the absolute identity of mind in us and nature outside us, the problem of the possibility of a nature external to us must be resolved. Before I go on, it's important to note the basis of the analysis as it concludes there. The basis of the analysis is quite simply the question how it is possible nature might not be what is doing the thinking. That's the basis of the inquiry. How is it possible that nature is not doing the thinking? In every single attempt to work out, that Schelling will pursue throughout the 50 or so pages of the introduction, in every single attempt to work out what sort of a conceptual apparatus would be necessary in order to generate something other than nature, a candidate non-nature, if you like, that would be capable of thinking, it fails. When Schelling concludes with the absolute identity of mind in us and nature outside us, the in us and outside us are emphasized, leading to the view that, or leading to the suspicion that, perhaps, the spatiality of the problem is one of its dimensions, one of the things that Schelling wants to draw our attention to. But this, nonetheless, this spatial dimension of the problem, is where Schelling argues that the problem of a possibility of nature external to us must be resolved. A nature external to us must be resolved within the domain, in other words, of the identity of mind and nature. It would be tempting at this point to say that works both ways. But we'll see in a moment that reciprocity is voided by antecedents as we go through the analysis. This passage then, and I will return to it, so I'll keep it to hand, proposes several crucial questions in vital ways. Firstly, how do ideas arise and get into us? The German there is entstand for arise, rather than how we produce and project representations. This is the argument of Plato against Kant, if you like. How do ideas arise and get into us, not how we produce representations? Granting a capacity for arbitrary generation that we witness that we have, hence the possibility of error, for example, what necessarily underlies this capacity such that it is shared not simply by me or by some of us, but by the entire species, transhistorically. What makes it possible that an entire species, in other words, can generate arbitrarily, can generate projections, representations arbitrarily? 3, under what conditions is a contingent coincidence of mind and nature conceivable? How is it possible, in other words, that mind and nature are merely coincidentally identical, rather than, one would have to say something like actually coincidental? What follows, therefore, if the identity between mind and nature is given? 5th, why identity does not entail the elimination of concept and nature, nor their reciprocal nor mutual maintenance. All of these problems culminate in a single question, requiring that the first 5 be developed before it is addressed. This culminating question is, what is nature? Let us start with the first of these Schellingian problems. Schelling writes, "For we require to know not how such a nature arose outside us, but how even the very idea of such a nature has gotten into us." Schelling is not yet asking, how does nature as such arise? Since we do not, he says, require to know this in order to solve the initial problem. The problem is how the idea of such a nature gets into us. 2 things are immediately apparent. Firstly, that the existence of nature is not at issue. That means the existence of nature is not contested. Okay? Not contested. The existence of nature is not at issue. Nor yet whether it simply whether it simply is or becomes. Nor, in other words, whether the world, whether nature is eternal, as Proclus used to argue with Philoponus about, or whether the laws of nature are immutable. This is not yet at issue. None of these questions are yet posed. The other question, however, that is posed is the question of how it is that the ideas not arise, but how they enter into us, how they generate thinking. How is it that external ideas generate thinking? Secondly, the second problem that arises is the problem of access that bedevils both transcendental philosophy and epistemology. And this relation, this problem of access, is inverted by Schelling's passage. The inversion takes place on a 2-fold basis. Firstly, on that of an idea that does not arise from us, but rather accesses us. The second such basis arises from the fact that nor do we yet know what this us might be, although it is an us rather than an I. We learn only later in our passage that the basis of the us is Geschlecht, is species, kind, or race in the sense of human race. The inversion of the access problem from how can I know nature to how does the idea of nature enter our species is therefore naturalistic to this extent. So it is into the species that the idea enters. While the Platonism of this account ought to be immediately evident, it is equally clear that if ideas enter species, then they cannot be of another kind if ideas enter species, then they cannot be of another kind than species more generally. Accordingly, Schelling disputes the two worlds model of Platonism, along with Proclus on the one hand, Bosanquet and Boehme on the other. This is Gernot Boehme in his characterization of Plato's theoretical philosophy. I'm going to read in particular from a passage he writes about the Timaeus. Plato's cosmology, he says, can be characterized as his theory of nature or of natural science. And there's an interesting equivocation there, to which I may return. But we must also note that accordingly, nature in the modern sense is restricted as that domain of being that is empirically given through, that is, sense perception. Like the pre-Socratics, Plato himself has a concept of nature as physis, by which being as a whole is intended. And since for him the ideas are actual entities, they are also, in the proper sense, nature. That's Gernot Boehme from 2000, end of quote. Accordingly, Schelling is at odds both with those who consider Platonism isomorphic with Cartesian rationalism and with those who consider it coextensive with the abstract formalism of the mathematized natural sciences. Amongst these we must mention McDowell, who presents natural science as rampant Platonism. I wonder if that were true, what natural science would look like. That would be an extraordinary question. It's a wonderful claim, though, and I want to understand why. He draws the lessons by which he draws from which he draws this conclusion themselves stem from a species of German idealist source. In order that McDowell's advocated second nature naturalism, not abandon scientistic naturalism to Platonism, second nature must, McDowell recommends, embrace the first under the moulding of ethical character. Platonism on this view is the abstraction of nature from life, against which McDowell recommends a nature that integrates the behaviour of finite ethical beings into the same world towards which minds are insuperably directed. By the way, I must mention this moulding of ethical character is a phrase that McDowell uses. And as far as I can tell, its source is more or less unchanged. It's Bernard Bosanquet, and it appears in his Value and Destiny of the Individual, 1923. It's an extraordinary claim to make, a moulding of ethical character, to an extent Aristotelian, obviously, in source, but the fact that it's exactly the same words, as Bosanquet suggests, that perhaps McDowell's Hegelianism is mediated by some of the British idealists that we have almost all forgotten, hence the hatred for the term of philosophical history. Okay, so Platonism on this view is the abstraction of nature from life, against which McDowell recommends a nature that integrates the behaviour of finite ethical beings into the same world towards which minds are insuperably directed. The question as to where, therefore, ideas arise is set alongside that of arising or emergence more generally. As Schelling puts it in his early Plato studies, Platonism proper concerns the study of das Werden zum Sein, the becoming of being, a translation of a line from Plato's Philebus 26d8, Genesis eis ousian. Recalling Boehmer's account of the ideas as nature, Schelling's advocated one-world Platonic naturalism is one wherein nature is generated through its ideas. The inversion of the access problem has the following ultimate consequence, therefore. It pits a realism concerning the Platonic idea against the Kantian representation or Vorstellung. It presents, in other words, Platonist metaphysics against transcendental philosophy. The action, that is, of arbitrarily generating a representation disconnected not only from nature outside me, but also arising only within me, albeit from an unknown source, may have as its positive element the confident outlook of a nature to be produced. But it is a production that can neither be accounted for from reality, nor in terms of a reality finally made. The latter remains a desideratum, and as such acknowledged us from the outset, as Hegel claims against Fichte, that it neither is nor can actually be save as a desideratum. With this, we move to the second of Schelling's questions. The inquiry does not concern a representation of nature such as we have arbitrarily generated, but, he says, how and why it originally and necessarily underlies everything that our species has ever thought about nature. In other words, the totality of thinkables, the totality of the intelligibles that is nature. This is Schelling's question, or the second problem we derive from the passage we are discussing. Granting, that is, that the capacity for arbitrary, i.e. non-necessary generation exists, transcendental philosophy itself demands that we ask what necessarily underlies this capacity for invention. Insofar as anything necessary does underlie it, the arbitrary is its product. Insofar as it does not, then whatever underlies representation has no relation whatever to representations, which become arbitrary, therefore, in the strong sense. That is, that there is no reason for the arbitrary production of representations at all. Since this is precisely, as we have seen, what transcendental arguments set out to disprove by arguing that there is an a priori relation between concept and object, some necessary basis of whatever nature is in fact assumed. This being the case, the question, what is its nature, leads to the following problem. Either the necessity is a necessity that attaches simply to the function of forging experience, spontaneity, which does not prove but reiterates the claim that there are unmotivated productions of representations, or the necessity is such as to withdraw the authority for their production from spontaneity, the function of forging experience, and to place it, as Schelling recommends, in the species. Accordingly, the thesis is here that it is in the nature of the species to generate representations via, we recall, the introduction of ideas of the same nature as those species into their members, qua members of species. Summing up so far, Ideas access species susceptible to them, and that species is one, that is, nature. Thus there are ideas qua species, and species that themselves are ideas of ideas, all of one nature. The third of Schelling's problems thus arises, namely, under what conditions are arbitrary productions conceivable given the foregoing? Since these conditions belong not to spontaneity in isolation from nature, but rather to natural necessity, it follows that nature necessitates arbitrariness. Were this not the case, no natural productions would terminate in dead ends. Nature could never lie in ruins, and the eternity of the world is therefore secured. Consequences thus emerge, however, for the answer to the question, what is nature, that guides this inquiry. The first of these is that since arbitrariness is possibilized by nature, nature does not necessitate mutation, accident, change, error, and extinction, such that it simply is the Verden zum Sein Plato and Schelling describe, except where such events do in fact occur. It must equally be possible that arbitrariness possibilize utter stillness, complete rest, even the absence of events, or ultimately the elimination of being. Whichever arbitrariness ensues, however, nature is such as necessitates it. The specific arbitrariness, or, better, coincidence, Schelling next problematizes, however, is that of nature and mind. To what extent is such a coincidence conceivable as arbitrary? Firstly, we must note that the passage does not demonstrate that the coincidence occurs, nor even stipulate how it might occur. It aims rather to demonstrate such a coincidence remains inconceivable if it is brought about by some third intermediary. Kant gives us an example of such a third in the concept of relation that underlies the coincidence of nature and mind without causing it. Coincidence on this view remains coincidence solely and exclusively if the coincident elements remain A, capable of non-coincidence, such that the bond between them is not one that necessitates, and B, separable therefore from the bond that unites them, hence third element. But is coincidence thereby explained? In his excellent book All or Nothing, Systematicity, Transcendental Arguments and Skepticism in German Idealism, Paul W. Franks argues that German idealism was motivated to respond to the skeptical challenges it encountered from Humean and other sources. Franks describes the form these challenges take as the Agrippin trilemma. To the question, why X, all answers will either A, lack justification, B, supply a justification that re-triggers the why question, rather than resolving it, creating a regress, or C, presuppose what they seek to establish. Thus, when Hume seeks to demonstrate the inconclusiveness of relying on reason to explain nature, he has Philo ask, what particular privilege, I'm enjoying this too much, what particular privilege has this little agitation of the brain, which we call thought, that we must make it the model of the whole universe? Philo's question seeks to demonstrate, to the contrary of a putative Schellingian account, that even conceding thought to obey natural necessity, there is no reason to assume what is true of the part to be true of the whole. The coincidence, in other words, between thought and the universe is absolute in the sense of mere coincidence. It renders any attempt to argue for a necessity, for instance, between the causal patterns involved in the production of thought and those involved in the production of other events or entities, A, unjustified, it does not answer the why question, B, therefore, re-triggers the why question, and C, therefore, is regressive. On this basis, no demonstration of the coincidence as other than absolute can succeed. The only positive conclusion, therefore, is the impotence of reason on a cosmic scale. Schelling's strategy, however, this is how Schelling, if you like, combats the Agrippin trilemma, is to argue not from coincidence, since, as we have seen, coincidence presupposes a separation for which we have no justification. Rather, he argues from the necessity attaching to the production of thought that Philo's opening gambit itself acknowledges. Given that such a coincidence occurs, that thought and nature co-advene, so to speak, then no explanation can satisfy the phenomenon unless it is necessitated not at the level of content, but rather of event, by the nature that underlies its possibility in species. To this extent, Schelling argues in strict transcendental mode, asking after the conditions of possibility attaching to the coincidence of thought and nature, but I would add only to this extent. However, the passage goes on to stipulate the requirements for satisfying the question. nature is only nature. Nature is only nature when she herself, writes Schelling, necessarily and originally, not only expresses but even realizes laws of mind. Nature is only nature when she herself necessarily and originally not only expresses but even realizes laws of mind. In other words, not only is it necessary, the only possible candidate for thinking is in fact nature, but nature is only nature insofar as it is a nature capable of thinking. So this is the conclusion, as it were, of the passage we're examining from Schelling. Nature is nature only if it's capable of realizing and expressing the laws of mind. The passage does not state the conditions under which this might occur, since it articulates as fundamental a condition that is not a terminus to a deduction, but rather opens the conditions attaching to the laws of mind to a naturalism whose basis is neither given in experience nor in pure thought. The cost, in other words, of the absolutization of coincidence is the abolition of absolute termini, and therefore of a spontaneity that can be restricted to a single domain of being. If, that is, there is spontaneity, it belongs to all nature. What we do learn, however, is that a nature for which mind is not possible is not a nature at all, from which it follows that there is no nature that does not produce mind. The nature that belongs at once to the nature of the species and to that of ideas that access species. I'm sorry, I've just realized that this is for me.
What are you thinking about time?
Yeah.
I think you're okay. No. Sorry, that was
right.
just sitting
okay.
there.
Right.
Apologies.
No, that's all right. These things happen. The possibility of error. What we do learn, however, is that a nature for which mind is not possible is not a nature at all, from which it follows that there is no nature that does not produce mind. Note, this is not, there is no nature that does not produce a human mind, nor a mind that is recognizable to finite rational beings such as we have experience of. The condition is not empirical, the condition is merely productive. Okay? So nature is only nature insofar as it produces mind. Accordingly, if the identity is given, question 4, what follows? Firstly, that nature philosophizes, so to the extent that the idea and nature are separated, this must be derivative rather than original condition. If minds conceive themselves to be other than nature, this too must be a product of natural history. Philosophy as mental errancy. Secondly, that insofar as nature is capable of the idea, no thought is not a natural occurrence. Thirdly, that insofar as there is thought of whatever kind, then because it does coincide with one domain, because it does coincide in one domain of being, it cannot be impossible that it is coincident also in others. Fourthly, just as we cannot lay claim to the thesis that anything capable of arbitrariness is therefore universally arbitrary, nor can we claim that the identity of thought and nature is incapable of their dichotomy. Nature must be equally capable both of their identity and their dichotomy. Our penultimate Schellingian problem therefore concerns the nature of identity and its consequences as regards the apparent equivalence or non-decidability of unity over dichotomy, or necessity over arbitrariness. When we consider thought and nature as coincident and seek reasons for their identity as advening consequently upon their separate natures, such reasons remain arbitrary additions that demand explanation rather than offering any, since such a conception of identity presupposes what it seeks to explain. Moreover, there is something of a paradox in the claim that x and y are identical, since if they were, then either x is not x but y, or y is not y but x. But even x is identical to x fails Leibniz's law on grounds of numerical distinction. On the contrary view, that identity is antecedent to particulars, it can never be the case that particulars are identical one to another. In fact, as Schelling writes in his presentation of my system of philosophy from 1801, everything that is absolute identity itself. On the one hand, that is, all is one, to the extent that everything is. On the other hand, it is in that everything is that it is, i.e. cannot not be identity itself. We may say, therefore, that for Schelling, identity attaches to being rather than to beings, or that unity is antecedent to duplicity. In other words, identity differentiates rather than integrates. As a provisional answer, therefore, to the question posed at the head of this section, and that we have sought a guide to in Schelling's considerations of the relationship between nature and transcendental philosophy, we may say that nature is precisely the identity that dichotomizes, or that self-differentiates into the totality of entities, das All, or the universe. Why does this not entail the kind of reciprocity that, for instance, Ted Toadvine finds at the heart of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy of nature? I do not say that he is necessarily correct in his assessment, merely that he expresses a marked tendency to redescribe coincidence as reflective necessity. We have seen that opening transcendental inquiries to termini sequestered in particular domains of being remains inconsistent unless it is absolutized, so that such a transcendental philosopher could claim that there is being because there is thinking. But we have not seen that nature supplies other termini, but rather that it replaces one set of terms with a ground that recedes from epistemic or transcendental access precisely where thought and nature coincide. What this means is that whatever grounds is not merely logically or chronologically prior to what is grounded, but rather there is always an ontogenetically antecedent for any product or event that accesses us, despite our inability to access it. This is what nature is for German idealism. At once unlimited production and its ruins, the world phoenix, as Kant and Thomas Carlyle both have it, antecedent to the production of thought it necessitates, and the accordingly unlimited, save through all its possible productions and their source. As to these termini ad quo or ad quem, these limits or sources, they can never be recovered as by a thought that remains, after all, an additional product of these same sources. The terminus, therefore, of transcendental philosophy is the philosophy of nature precisely because the latter alone can demonstrate that there is no terminus that is not conditioned. It must stop there.
Thank you very much, Iain. Very, very interesting paper. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Yeah.
You said, okay, so it can only be nature thinks. Nature can only be nature to the extent that it thinks. And then you said, and therefore, and this must be the case, nature determines that minds conceive of themselves as other than nature. But why? Why does it do that? It does do that, but why does it do that?
What is the reason why nature must be the determinant of mind thinking itself as other than nature? Or
why does nature determine that minds conceive of themselves as other than nature, given that they're not? They're not other than nature, but they conceive of themselves as other than nature.
Why does that happen?
Why does nature do that? Does Schelling tell us?
He does, because he proposes that the question so posed is articulated in terms that belong ultimately to practical philosophy. In other words, that nature should intend such and such an outcome is a question that is, as it were, transferred onto nature by transcendental subjects, by finite ethical beings. He, in other words, explains the production of errancy on the basis of errancy already having been produced. Since the reason for it is the same as the reason for any other thought. Remember, it's not the determination of the content of thought, but of the fact of it, of the act of it, of the event of it. Then it would follow necessarily that it's only and only can be nature that's responsible for it.
It's not just any old error, it's the biggest error conceivable.
It's the error of seeking spontaneity in a limited domain of being. Yes, I agree. So you want a stronger explanation than Schelling offers of why that is. That's a fascinating problem. The idea that it may be not simply a necessary production in the sense that, like all productions, it is necessitated, but also that this particular production is something that's necessary, or a necessary error, something of that nature. And we arrive at some Nietzschean problematics, some nice Nietzschean problematics. You know, I fear we are not getting rid of God because we still believe in grammar, for example. You know, the other side of the claim, however, though, is what is it that spontaneity refers to? It is not, if you like, the attempt to restrict spontaneity to the domain of finite ethical beings is an attempt that fails not because there is none, but because if there is spontaneity, then it falls not to the remit or this or that domain of being, but rather to the whole of it. In other words, the laws obeyed are as much a local question, as it were, as the necessity involving that laws are obeyed is a universal one. So there's that kind of problem as well, I think, which the question raises. But I think you're generating more interesting questions than I'm able to answer.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
I've got another one.
Go ahead. Yeah?
Why do ideas access only species susceptible to them?
Right. Well, there are two questions there. One is, are there species that are non-susceptible to ideas? And there's an additional part of this I wanted to go on to.
What's susceptibility?
What is susceptibility? There is a well. No. Let me go the other way around. The way I started, I was going to go into this and the problem of form, which I think is a problem which transcendental philosophy does have as as its remit specifically to address. The species that are susceptible, as it were, to access by the ideas, are not given or restricted by anything that we've encountered so far. So the only possible account we can give on the basis of what we've seen so far, and this is indeed the basis that is cashed out by Schelling later, is that there is no such thing as a species that is non-accessible to the idea. This is not to say that there is any species to which the idea is accessible. It merely says that there is no such thing as a species that is not accessible to the idea. That means that there is one species, and that one species is nature. So we're asking, therefore, about the nature of ideas. What are ideas? And these questions are ancient and Platonic questions concerning the nature of eidos, of form, of ideation, and moreover, of production. This is a more critical function, I think, than it has a constitutive one in the present context. For example, the production of anything by an idea is held to be an impossibility by most contemporary commentators on what is or most people who describe Platonic metaphysics as two worlds, held to be impossible. The idea that ideas could cause is held to be impossible. The reason for that is ideas are entirely misconceived as being representations. So it's precisely because there is an obfuscation of the nature of the idea on the basis of what a representation is that we're incapable of seeing that there is any causal dimension attaching to the nature of the idea. However, and this underscores the extent to which it's a local problem. Proclus argues, for example, as does Bosanquet, as does Whitehead also, that the idea is precisely to be understood in a causal way. Whitehead calls it immanent law. So there is this contest which is obscured to the extent that the entire and complete inheritance of German idealism is held to be the preparation of second nature, which is none other than the triumph of spontaneity over nature as such, and which we've witnessed, for example, most clearly in McDowell. So that's why I think it has a critical function in the present context, more than a constitutive one.
Will? Oh, you? No. Were you? I think Will was.
Mine for next. I don't mind.
Yeah.
Do you want? Oh, okay. I want to push this evolutionary Platonism a bit further, and especially in relation to the question of anthropology. You know, where are we in this story? I suppose if I was thinking of a kind of an image, I can imagine that we as a species destroy ourselves, which is pretty easy. I imagine. Let's say in 100 years we don't exist anymore. Is it possible? And then could we imagine, I don't know, slugs evolving to a certain point where over a millennium and millions of years they get to a point where they would have access to ideas. Now I suppose the kind of ridiculous question here is, would these ideas be the same to them as they are to us? Would they be thinking the same ideas? Obviously not in the same form.
The question, though, depends on the on an inversion of a Platonic understanding, a Schellingian understanding of the idea and its access to species. It's not the species accessing the idea, but the idea accessing the species. However, accepting the terms of the problem as you pose it, this is a problem that Kant encounters and has this terrible fuss about in both the Critique of Judgment and in the Opus Posthumum. He gets quite scared at the prospect that the fossil record betrays no sign of any remnants of man. Indeed, there's a fascinating story that a guy called Scheuchzer discovered that there were remains. He claimed to be remains of man from the time of the flood, Homo diluvii testis, he called it, only to be disproved by Cuvier, and that the remains were in fact those of a salamander, which begs the question about forms of thinking and what causes them. An extraordinary claim. If there is no necessity attaching to the production of any particular species, then there can be no necessity attaching to their elimination, but nor can there be any necessity attaching to their continuation. It would follow that the production of ideas cannot be contingently limited on the basis of the species in which they reproduce, as it were. So evolutionary, yes, in the sense that capable of a history that admits in a minimal way of antecedents and consequence. Evolutionary also in the sense of causal and of unpredictable, largely. So the question of the similitude of these two particulars, the slug's thought, which I was just momentarily considering there. The idea of a slug thought is wonderful. How do slugs think? It is a beautiful question. And the human thought, or the thought of a cat, for example. The thought of a cat, is a cat slug possible? Now, insofar as we think that there is the question is not absurd, we are presupposing that there is a plausible identity, or at least a plausibly specifiable difference between the two domains, between the slug mentation and between human mentation. And if we think that difference is plausibly specifiable, then the difference is plausibly specifiable. What it would be consequent upon would be the production of those particular forms and their actual differences. And since those forms are the same for all production of all thinking, insofar as they are forms that access the species that reproduce them, if you like, then it follows that the identity of the forms precedes the differentiation that they produce, such that identity relations cannot attach to their products, but only to their production. So that, I think, is the extent of the change in the problem. I think that's one of the things I'm really interested in exploring, is the extent to which the problem has changed and how the questions change as a consequence of it. But the bottom line is, as it were, not the kind of is a naturalism, but a naturalism capable, as it were, not of this or that limited domain of being, but a naturalism capable of nature.
I think we moved to time for one last question, I think, and then it's time for
I'm just wondering, in what way does Schelling talk about distinction between concepts and intuitions? Because you're talking about Kant, and it seems that he appropriates Kant's notion of this. I'm not sure if he does entirely. I'm just stating this as an example. We have Schopenhauer, and he sharply criticizes that distinction. And on account of that, he brings in the ideas as sort of a mediating link. Because it seems to me, if we use this sort of really idealistic sense of Kant, then it's easy to call nature a product of mind, and vice versa, because it is a concept. So, for example, with Schopenhauer, we'd say, well, no, it's will, in this sense. But in what way does he deal with that?
The distinction that Schelling tends to make is not between concept and intuition, but between concept and idea, interestingly, between Begriff and Idee. Vorstellung is used almost exclusively, representation is used almost exclusively throughout this critical discussion that forms the introduction to the ideas of the philosophy of nature. The concept of intuition is one that belongs, therefore, or the concept of intuition for Schelling is only really addressed in the system of transcendental idealism. To the best of my knowledge, where it's addressed in the following terms. When I say I have an intuition of a cube, what I'm claiming is that my imagination is active in the form of a cube. So it's a kind of question of the induction of forms. And this question of the induction of forms is something that he proceeds to use in order to differentiate concept from idea. The concept is simply a restricted extension. So there is no disjunction, as it were, between concept and intuition at the level of kind, but there is a difference at the level of degree. And the level of degree is the level of extension. You know, my intuition is active in the form of a cube. The concept of a cube is determinant of a domain larger than my imagination or my intuition of it. And the idea that produces it is larger still. So there's a kind of quite a systematic, quite a Neoplatonic understanding of this, if you like, ladder of ideation that Schelling develops, that I don't think is vulnerable to the kind of claim that would turn the nature that he's talking about into the nature that is one that is produced by mind. Since, after all, the fact that my intuition is active in the form of a cube has itself to be accounted for, and it cannot be accounted for, we know, in transcendental terms reducibly, since the fact of the activity must derive from occasioning causes, Gelegenheitsursachen, as Kant calls them, or in fact from what is, from being. It is being, ultimately, that is responsible for my intuition, being that is responsible for concepts, being that is responsible for the ideas that make those possible in the first place. So I question even the extent to which we can accommodate Schelling within a conception of idealism that has as its remit, as it were, the elimination of nature. That's part of what I'm trying to explain.
Okay, well with that, it just leaves to me to thank Iain for a very interesting paper, and thanks for the discussion. Thank you.